Hey guys, John here with another Terrainify video, and today I'm going to show you how to create the Loosestrife Valley theme using a stub outcropping. So this is the raw print straight from the printer, and there are several steps to go through before we get to the finished piece. Fortunately, most of the time that you're going to spend working on this is actually going to be just waiting for stuff to dry in between steps. So the first step is applying sand. So I'm just going to apply white glue directly to the piece. And this is both to give it a little bit more texture as well as to give the flock and paint something to stick to. And once the glue is applied, get a cheap brush. Here I'm just using a stencil brush. Work the glue around, spread it out. The trick here is to use enough glue to allow good adhesion, but not so much that the sand is kind of running off or dripping once you finish applying it. And this is a small piece, so I'm just doing the whole thing at once. Now if you're doing a larger piece, you'll probably find that it's easier to do a small section at a time. Okay, now we're going to start with the coarse sand. And you can use a cup or a container if you want, but I'm just going to use my fingers because this is a pretty small piece. This is more just for accent. We're not trying to cover the whole piece with the coarse sand. Just want to put a little bit here and there and try to focus it on areas of the model where loose rock and debris would collect. Okay, now I'm going to tap it, shake it off. Now we're going to do the fine sand. Same thing, except this time we're going to cover the entire piece. And you may find that using a cup is easier. I just like to use my hands for the most part. Once you're done applying the sand, then same thing, just shake it off. And give it a nice tap. And then the last step before putting this aside to dry is to seal it with a water white glue mixture. So it's about a 3:1 to 4:1 ratio of water to white glue. So you want it really runny. The exact ratio doesn't matter, but you want it to look something like this, where you can, it's very liquidy, but it does have a white color to it, so you can see the, you can see the glue in there. And I'm just not trying to really soak it, just trying to put enough to make sure everything gets covered. And that's about right. Definitely no more than that. And that's probably a little bit heavy, to be honest, so I'm gonna, before I put it in front of the fan, I'm going to just let a little bit of this run off into the sink. So I'm going to put this in front of the fan to dry, and I'll be back in a bit. Okay, the sand is dry, so the next step is to prime it. I'm just going to be using some cheap craft black paint for this. And normally you want to thin it down a little, so you might want to pre-mix it before applying it. But I'm a degenerate, so I'm just going to put it straight on from the bottle and then use my brush. Dip the brush in a little water as necessary. Alright, that's a good amount to start. Gonna get some water on my brush. And here we go. You could also use an airbrush for this, but I'm trying to show you how you can just use very simple, common painting and hobby tools. An airbrush would be faster, but this won't take very long. And just a couple of things to keep in mind here. Of course, since we're using paint and water, that is going to have the effect of loosening the sand. So after you apply the paint to any particular spot, you don't want to keep working it for a long time, because as the sand loosens, if you keep trying to paint it, then you'll end up wiping the sand away with the brush. So again, the ideal is to do this in one sitting, one step, one coat, but chances are when you go back to it after the paint dries, you'll see some spots that you missed. And especially if you're doing a bigger piece. I mean, this piece is pretty small, but even on this one there's some nooks and crannies that are hard to reach. So if you've missed some spots, then it's very easy to just touch it up after the first coat dries. Okay, well that should do it. So I'm going to go stick this in front of the fan and I'll be back. Okay, a quick side note. The reason why there's some extra marks and other stuff on the mat now is because while I was waiting for the piece to dry, I was doing some gluing and other work, and I was just using it as a work surface. So that's all that is. When you dry brush a piece, you want to make sure that it's completely dry, because you don't want any of the sand to come off when you're dry brushing. And you also want to make sure your brush is completely dry as well, because the purpose of dry brushing is to deposit paint on the raised surfaces of the piece. It's just like painting miniatures, same thing with terrain. So you want the brush to be pigment heavy, so very little, if any, liquid on it. So I'm going to start with burnt umber. So put a decent amount of paint on the brush, and there's different ways to do this. You can put your paint in a cup and work from there. This piece is small enough that I'm just going to do it right on the brush. And now I'm wiping off most of the excess, most of the paint I should say, so that as I keep working you can see that there's very little, as I move to a different area of the paper towel, there's very little paint that comes off. So that's about right. You're not going to see a dramatic difference using this color, and it's especially hard to really capture it on the with a camera, but it does change it. It makes it a very dark brown as opposed to the flat black base coat. Now that I'm finished applying the burnt umber, I'm going to put on the next two colors, a couple of shades of gray. The first is going to be a medium dark gray, and then the last one's going to be a lighter gray, just for more highlighting. Now you can either use a new brush that's already dry, or you can just clean the one you've been using. Just make sure you squeeze it out and thoroughly dry it as much as possible, because you don't want the paint to be, you don't want to add extra water to the mix when you're dry brushing. So okay, that should be good. And for the Loosestrife Valley theme, the gray is going to be applied just to the rocky areas. So basically the sides, like the vertical surfaces, not so much the horizontal ones, just where the rocks are showing through. So the burnt umber provides a nice base color for the soil and for the rocks themselves. Now of course, as you're doing this, even though you're focusing on the sides, you're still going to get some paint onto the other areas, and that's fine. Dry brushing is a very imprecise process. Alright, looking good with the first layer of gray. Now I'm just going to go right to the second layer. I'm not going to rinse the brush this time, because they're close enough that having a little bit of the darker gray still on the brush is not going to drastically alter the color of the lighter gray. I'm going to apply it a little bit more sparingly, because this is more of a final highlight color. The first layer of gray was to really make the rocks stand out and give them gray color, so they no longer look brown. Okay, applying flock is very similar to applying sand. First, apply some white glue, full strength, directly to the model. And I'm going to use my small stencil brush to spread it around. And similar to the sand, I'm just applying it basically to the top surfaces. Now normally when I would apply the flock, I use a large Rubbermaid container that's big enough to hold the piece over and just kind of use the shaker to pour it on directly. But just since I'm doing it in front of the camera, I'm just going to use the smaller one and just sprinkle it on by hand. So I'm just covering the entire model with a large amount of flock, and then after you put it on, just turn it over, give it some good taps. And now, just like with the sand, I'm going to apply a little sealer. And again, you don't want to drench it, you want to get the whole thing wet, but you don't want to use so much that you're getting a lot of runoff. So that's flock. Now I just have to let it dry. Next, we're going to apply the Superturf, and this is another straightforward process. Just going to apply the glue at full strength to various spots on the model, and just gonna put some here and there wherever it would look good, you know, nooks and crannies. You want to focus on the nooks and crannies, you know, places where shrubs and other low-lying foliage would tend to grow. You do want to put a little bit in the open areas as well. And you want to make sure you're using a generous amount of glue. Alright, once the glue is applied, then just take some clumps and press them into place. And again, if I had my bigger container, I could also just dump it straight from the canister and then shake off the excess. But today I'm just going to do it all by hand. Now, if you feel like you missed any spots or you want to just add a little bit more here or there, then all you have to do is apply a little more glue and a little more turf. Okay, the last thing to do for this step is to once again seal it. And in this case, you want to use a higher concentration of glue in the sealer, because the just the way the Superturf is, if it's too watery, the glue will just run off of it and it's not really going to do much to hold it in place. Okay, once more in front of the drying table, and then we'll be ready for the last step. Alright guys, we're on to the last step now. So we already have a perfectly good looking functional piece of terrain, and what adding the grass tufts is going to do will be to give it just a little bit more variety in color and just really make it pop. So for the Loosestrife Valley theme, I'm going to be using these white and purple flowers on top of green grass tufts. So I've got my reverse action tweezers, and I'm just going to grab a clump and then apply a good amount of white glue to the bottom. Find a spot where you want to place it and push it into place. And of course, this is your last opportunity to cover up any mistakes or imperfections. I don't know if it'll show up really well or not, but right here the glue is kind of went on a little thick with the sealer, so it gave it kind of a strange texture. It gave the flock a strange texture when it dried. So I'll just cover that up. If you're not cheating and covering up your mistakes, you're not doing terrain right. Alright, I think that looks pretty good. So I'm going to call that finished. And at this point, all you have to do is wait for the tufts to dry, and your terrain piece is finished. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. The techniques that I've demonstrated here can be applied to your own terrain pieces, but if you're interested in getting a copy of this piece, check the video description for links. Thanks for watching, and happy gaming!